Okay. So thank you so much, all of you who are tuning in to watch this workshop presented by the Critical Ecology Lab. The title of this workshop is Theoretical Lineage of Critical Ecology, and I am Suzanne Pierre. I'm the founder and director of the Critical Ecology Lab, co-presenting here with my colleague Ilexis Chu-Jacoby. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a biogeochemist and ecosystems ecologist by training, as well as a critical ecologist.
Hi, my name is Ilexis. My pronouns are they, them. I'm queer, non-binary, and of mixed Taiwanese and Salvadorian descent. I'll be starting a PhD program in integrative plant science this fall at Cornell University, and I'll be studying the critical ecology of soil ecosystems of medicinal plants.
Awesome. Thank you, Ilexis. Thank you for being here with me today. All right, I'm excited to present. This slide says July 15th. That was the initial date that we presented this workshop, and we are presenting it an encore today, August 10th, 2021. All right, so to orient you to our agenda here, we will start by sharing the Critical Ecology Lab tenets or group norms. We will do a moment of land acknowledgement and further support for sovereignty and land back movements. We will then move on to an overview of critical ecology, how it's related to global change science, why global change science needs critical ecology and where that has come from, the thought lineages that contributed to my development of critical ecology, along with colleagues in the lab. We'll talk about decolonization in academic research, what that means in practice. We'll also talk about reflexivity in research, so connecting the self to this work. And in our initial presentation, we did some breakout rooms and some debriefing, and we will do some version of that in this recording as well. All right, so we'll start with tenet number 1, growth and discomfort. So these tenets, I guess I'll preface by saying these are our group norms for the Critical Ecology Lab, written by myself and my colleague Kunal Palawat. And we have used these as a source of grounding for our lab meetings and all of our engagements. And so these are our expectations for how we operate within our container. So allowing ourselves to engage with being wrong or called out /in and making mistakes is a gift to ourselves that makes us better people and researchers. There is a difference between uncomfortable and unsafe situations, and it is important to analyze where a situation falls.
Honoring Indigenous futures and histories, we acknowledge the Indigenous populations who were violently removed from their ancestral lands. Our work must engage meaningfully with the past and futures of the local Indigenous communities and movement towards land sovereignty.
Healing and disturbance to collective well-being. In ecological systems, disturbance can generate state changes and resilience depending on how a system recovers. Through building a foundation of listening and respect and trust in the research container, we recover and grow resilient to disturbance.
Cultivating interdependence through compassion. Care within each working space can appear in different forms and results from a culture of listening and noticing. Offerings of care through communication, actions, and other supports set a tone for interdependence that creates resilience.
Listening and validating one another. Validation means acknowledgement and respect towards the lived experiences of others, even if they are not shared experiences. We are validated by deep listening and communication. This is part of upending inequality and building equity in science groups.
Multiple ways of knowing exist. Our research is the sum of the past, present, and future experiences of the communities from which individual practitioners come. We do not exist in isolation. We bring out personal histories and our community's histories. to the work that we do.
And welcoming boundary-breaking questions. Unique and creative questions can enter our research circles when people feel safe to bring their full selves, complete identity, concerns, experiences, fears, observations into the research container. We are willing to engage with challenging questions and tensions. Okay. So I live and work on unceded ancestral lands of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants and stewards of what is now known as Oakland, California, and the San Francisco Peninsula.
And I'm residing on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Mono and Tachi Yokut peoples, the original inhabitants and caretakers of Fresno, California. And we mourn the violent dispossession of these lands, and we honor their respective indigenous communities' ongoing connection to these lands, past and present, and stand in solidarity with their asks and demands for land back and indigenous sovereignty.
And I guess I'll just add that beyond this acknowledgement, all of this work is in the interest of furthering the goal of land back and indigenous sovereignty. And not only would we be unable to be doing this work without the loss of life, the loss of access, the loss of cultural heritage that indigenous peoples throughout the Americas have suffered, but this work is really towards addressing and upending that history.
Thank you, Sue.
So now I'll talk a little bit about what the Critical Ecology Lab is. So I founded the Critical Ecology Lab with the help of Kunal Palawat in early 2020, just around the start of the global COVID-19 pandemic. Very interesting time to start anything. But what that has resulted in is a really beautiful mix of what is a traditional research lab group and a social change and anti-oppression activist organization. So we live in between those two spaces where we do have a lot of connection to things like collaborative peer-reviewed research, using kind of basic science techniques in biophysical and natural sciences, where we prioritize mentoring undergraduate and graduate students who are interested in applying critical ecology to their work at different universities where they are enrolled, and organizing workshops just like this one, conference sessions, and collaborative publications that further the theory and practice of critical ecology. And then on the other hand, we are explicitly interested in the liberation of oppressed peoples. Our work is done through a fiscally sponsored 501c3 nonprofit. So we are separate from any other institution. We are not beholden to a university or any other sort of parent organization or political organization. That independence is really important to us because it allows us to work out what it means to not only do critical ecology as a research practice, but actually as a lived organizing practice as well, and community practice. So we're committed to social justice and anti-oppression. We are interested in co-creating our research with relevant communities and really bringing the leadership of folks who are not traditionally trained in academic science to our work to inform what we do. And we want to exemplify a culture of compassion and mutual reliance in science. That is, we want to upend the culture that derives from white supremacy, that engenders competition and harm to one another in the interest of advancing science. So that's just the opposite of what Critical Ecology Lab is. So that's just a little overview of how we operate. I won't go into more detail now. But from here, as I mentioned, we are kind of working at this intersection of basic science and social change. And the basic science from which critical ecology really derives is called global change science. So what is that? What is global change? So we understand that from the words global change, we're talking about processes happening, physical phenomena happening in the environment that are changing from historical norms, including climate change, but not limited to climate change. So from the academic journal Global Change Biology, they define it as any consistent trend in the environment, past, present, or projected, that affects a substantial part of the globe. Another major scientific work, a paper called Global Change Biology, a primer published in 2019, says, because of human action, the Earth has entered an era where profound changes in the global environment are creating novel conditions that will be discernible far into the future. So some examples of these novel conditions that are being mentioned here include increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, climate change resulting from those changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide, as well as other greenhouse gases, land transformation, species exploitation, exotic species invasions, eutrophication of soils and waters. And again, that is coming from the same paper, Global Change Biology, a primer. And so you see here in this definition from this paper that the words human action are invoked. And this is actually the only mention of the words human action in the entire paper that is meant to be a definitive introduction to what global change is. And so critical ecology, as I'll get into, is really interested in addressing and unpacking what human action is being referred to and the origins of that human action. So what we have here is a need for an answer, right, to that question. What about this human action? So in the basic science, here on my our far left side, we see that there's categorical agreement on the biophysical processes, right? The natural phenomena, or rather unnatural physical processes that are happening as a result of global change. And these are just a couple of examples of titles of research articles that really have driven us towards this consensus, right? Human drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, future of the human climate niche, the Anthropocene, is this a new epoch of geological time? We also are seeing an emerging response to this idea of human action being at the heart of global change, where we're starting, researchers are starting to acknowledge that there's a connection to power and inequality that has influenced these global change processes. So here are a couple more examples of articles that start to get at that from a more of an exploratory and discussion sense. So investigating why the Anthropocene began with European colonization, for example, and starting to get at, starting to use different lines of evidence to start explaining where this global change really originated from. But what remains absent is a unifying theory of the origin story of global change and a sense of its etiology. So our question today with this presentation is, how do we develop a liberatory etiology of global change from an epistemology that does not recreate sources of planetary and human trauma? So I'm going to just repeat that one more time because it's going to be important for guiding us through the rest of this talk. How do we develop a liberatory etiology of global change from an epistemology that does not recreate the sources of planetary and human trauma? Okay. So let's unpack some of these words. I'm going to let Ilexis take this kind of definition because this will guide us through a lot of what we'll talk about next.
Right. So the etiology is the study of causes, origins, and reasons behind a way that things are. It's a term that's derived from the medical sciences to describe how what the causes of a disease might be, but we're using it in the context of uncovering the origin stories that Western science and ecology and critical ecology are using to explain why we know what we know and why we ask the questions that we do. An epistemology is the study of knowledge and potential sources of knowledge. and justified belief. And pedagogy is the methods and practice of teaching, which is often intertwined with the epistemology, which is the study of the knowledge. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. So global change is lacking a unifying notion of why the problems that global change science studies or researches exist in the first place. And critical ecology is my response and our collective response to that need for a unifying theory. So we are seeking a liberatory epistemology for global change science, right? So I'm using this definition of liberatory epistemology. I'm taking this from a book by Heidi Graswick from 2011 called Liberatory Epistemology and the Sharing of Knowledge, Querying the Norms. So Graswick says, liberatory epistemology focuses on the role of knowledge production in the generation and maintenance of oppression, as well as the effects of oppression on the production and possibilities for knowledge. And I think that's just exactly what we aim to be developing here and teasing out here vis-a-vis global change science, where we're interested in how knowledge is produced and how that production of knowledge reinforces and supports oppression in broader society. And then as well as how the oppression itself shapes what we think we can know and who gets to do that investigating and knowing in the first place. So critical ecology, first of all, centers the experiences and conditions of people who identify with Black womanhood as a starting point for interrogating broader systems of oppression and the material, read biophysical worlds that these conditions create, right? So what we're engaging with here is, first of all, the idea that Black feminism as a theoretical body of work has so much to offer global change research, because Black feminism focuses on the production of knowledge given the oppression of Black women and other groups beyond Black women. And so if we're able to understand and center this kind of Black feminist philosophy, we start to open up the possibility for other oppressed groups to inform the question that we address within global change science. Further, now I'm quoting from a paper written by Dr. Chelsea Frazier, who is a professor of environmental literature, I believe, at Cornell. So Frazier says, following Winter, and she's referring to Sylvia Winter, I insist that the West itself, its divisions of space and its rigid notions of the human subject are insufficient frameworks through which global warming and severe climate change and the sharply unequal distribution of Earth's resources can effectively be addressed, can be effectively addressed. So here, we're interested in Frazier's treatment of how the West's framing of space and humanity are the basic constructions that support how we study global warming, climate change, and the distribution of resources on Earth. But that this is one epistemology, right? A Western science epistemology that is constraining what we can study and know about these issues of global warming and severe climate change. So to get into that a little more deeply, Frazier points out that concepts of divisions of space support capitalism's resource theft and dehumanization of certain groups of people, non-white, non-European groups of people. And despite an abundance of objective scientific evidence showing that Earth systems are fluid and vulnerable, right? So notions of property and spatial divisions and borders, which are central to a Western understanding of landscapes, a European understanding of how space is divided and constructed, these constructions are in direct conflict with what Western science itself tells us, that Earth systems are in constant conversation, are in constant interaction. And the study of biogeochemistry is one example that of a body of scientific research that shows us that the Western epistemology does not fit with the reality of the biophysical world. Critical ecology aims to repurpose this kind of basic science of, for example, biogeochemistry, of elemental recycling. Another example might be gene-environment interactions, to subvert capitalist knowledge production and bolster or support the Black feminist epistemology, right? So critical ecology is saying that we rely on the findings of basic science, and we know that it is complicated and contradictory often, that the advances of Western science are needed and necessary tools. At the same time, we need to connect these basic science tools and studies to actually explain global change, and in doing so, subvert capitalist knowledge production, right? In doing so, center Black feminism and other oppressed groups who are in solidarity with Black womanhood. And so finally, we'll just add that critical ecology, in a sense, aims to potentiate Black feminist theory, right? To take Black feminist theory away from the position of defense and the position of self-justification as a theory, and actually move it into the realm of physical application to natural science, right? So critical indigenous pedagogies as well as Black feminism can be potentiated and research as research methodologies through enacting these theories in the realms of geochemistry, biology, and ecology. Okay, so that is a broad explanation of how theories from what we typically relegate to social science and humanities, including critical indigenous pedagogy and Black feminism, are actually at the heart of understanding the origins of global change and how we go about studying global change. All right.
So along those lines, I'd like to go into some alternative research epistemologies that critical ecology will be drawing from and that we're starting to use as research methodologies or like implement into our research methodologies. So, and we later in the presentation will uncover some of the guiding motivations of Western ecological research. And just like a quick reminder for that, Western and colonial science, often the guiding motivations are to utilize nature for economic benefit and maximize profit with minimal input, which leads to producing scientific questions and metrics and results that will exacerbate and drive extractive processes. And as marginalized scientists, we are in a unique position to conduct ecological investigations from another origin story. Our guiding motivations are informed by our ancestral knowledge, our knowledge and resourcefulness from navigating a white supremacist world. And we see the pitfalls of capitalism and exploitation, and we're able to offer decolonial modes of investigation through research that is motivated by love, reciprocity, and healing. So these concepts come up a lot in the methodologies that I'm going to cover now, or epistemologies that I'm going to cover now. Right, so in the Maori indigenous pedagogy, there's an absence of the need for control, connection to moral community, where the primary goal is compassionate understanding of another's moral position. This research and learning model is inherently collaborative and participatory and driven by participant and community criteria. And in the Maori culture, these criteria are rooted in notions of self-determination, sacredness of relationships, and embodied understanding that is rooted in experience and prioritizing the community over the self. In African Indigenous pedagogy, the teacher and researcher is a selfless healer intent on inspiring, transforming, and propelling students to a higher spiritual level. So Cynthia D. Billard describes spirituality and transformation as central to healing methodologies, especially in response to the negation of African ascendant epistemologies in Western academia. In African Indigenous epistemologies, there is an explicit centering of the methods of the spirit, including unconditional love, compassion, reciprocity, ritual, and gratitude. And these methodologies are inextricably linked to community and to the research as a collective act. And Dillard describes this as it allowing us to be able to more clearly recognize humans in all our various ways of being. And back to Black feminism, there's a theory as a process of self-recovery, interiority, and collective liberation. And it acknowledges the researcher's identity and Black women's personal and intellectual positionality as an important and reciprocal relationship with the interior self and the community. And integrating these theories with ecological theory would mean acknowledging the researcher's positionality.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as Ilexis was saying, all of these epistemologies that derive from non-Western understandings of life and experience and culture are useful and really indispensable guides in thinking about how we go about determining what questions about our changing planet and the community, human communities that live in this changing and on this changing planet, what questions should be asked and how we can ask them. And these epistemologies of knowledge, right, of how we can know what we know, can shape how we go about the actual practice of asking questions. All of this goes towards all of these alternative epistemologies go towards this other word that we mentioned and defined earlier, etiology. So why does global change exist the way that it has? And how has the process or the phenomena involved in global change arisen the way that they have? What are the social roots, the ideological backings for those human actions that produced global change? And how can we use these alternative epistemologies to navigate that very study of the origin story of global change? And that is what critical ecology is set to do. So to really reinforce that, because like we haven't said it enough, critical ecology is meant to be an explanatory and transformative framework. Its goals are to quantitatively describe how historical and contemporary expropriation of resources and the social oppression are related to global change consequences. We're interested in decolonizing the practice of ecological inquiry by seeking to make Western systems of knowledge the object of critique and inquiry, and by making Western systems of political economy the through line of global change science, right? Creating a new heartbeat for global change science itself. We want to repurpose and expand traditional ecological science, right? What we mean by traditional there is not like traditional indigenous knowledge, but rather traditional Western science that is ecological in focus, And we want to expand that with an explicitly emancipatory goal, right? The word emancipation, which is responsive to the needs of general as well as specific human communities. I'll turn it to you, Ilexis.
Okay, so the way scientific research is regarded in society creates many barriers to entry, and there is privilege for who gets to ask scientific questions. With this privilege comes feelings of imposter syndrome and the notion that you must prove yourself in your ability to produce scientific papers and results that are on par with Western colonial standards. And there's little acknowledgement of what marginalized researchers have to bring to the table, connecting what we feel and what we know and our experiential knowledge. So our practice in scientific fields is often reduced to the value that we provide to academic spaces through diversity, equity, and initiative, or diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, where the institution that actively commits violence against our communities and excludes marginalized researchers gets to pat themselves on the back for counting and quotas of inclusivity. And DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is an external pressure response, increasingly normal and expected in academic spaces. There's a lot of diversity statements and commitments to community that are made that are never quite substantive because they don't acknowledge the colonial origin of the Western science or the institution. And the institution itself is responding on its shame while diverting attention to ever dismantling real justice, the real injustices that it commits. And this lack of physical and ideological representation in scientific research can often translate to a lack of interest in the scientific fields within marginalized communities. And it's kind of internalized as an imposter syndrome or self-doubt or awe feeling that is rooted in one's intuitive sense of maybe this isn't the science that I need to be doing, or maybe this isn't the science that my community needs me to do. Yeah, and I would like to share this quote by Lindy Tuiwai Smith. The word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. In the colonial context, research becomes an objective way of representing the dark-skinned other to the white world. So we can see how research has been weaponized against our communities in the past and how quickly white research institutions and epistemologies are to move past these violent histories when none of it has ever really been confronted. Next slide, please. So delving a little bit more into the guiding motivations behind Western research, I offered this quote by The Evolution of American Ecology, which is a book written by Sharon E. Kingsland. Research was linked to conservation work, where conservation specifically meant the management and efficient use of resources. The ideology underlying the conservation movement was faith in the gospel of efficiency. So it regarded, or Western ecology regards nature as an asset for economic development and conservation of resources for a particular purpose, and that purpose is profit. It minimizes the inputs and maximizes the outputs, and it justifies extractive processes. And we're here contextualizing the guiding principles of ecology in early American capitalism, which, as a reminder, is reliant upon the seizure of land, the forced removal and displacement of indigenous peoples, and chattel slavery. And this is what the American economy was built upon. So it's also interesting to kind of interrogate the gospel of efficiency, gospel as in a faith to live by. And early American capitalism drove off the same drove the same line in ecology as it did in the federal government and in business. And these aligning guiding principles are to treat nature as an asset. And this concept is widely contested in a good feeling and strategic way in like neoliberalism. We can go into this in the next slide. Oh, sorry, not this next slide. Later in the presentation.
Yeah, and before we move on to that next slide, I just, you put it really well, Ilexis, and I think that this quote really ties together kind of the argument that we are making in presenting critical ecology as a distinct approach to studying global change, because your quote from Kingsland here is really emphasizing the fact that the background of early ecology in the United States is so deeply linked to managing a country that had recently been stolen, right? In managing efficiently the resources that would make that young country profitable and wealthy. And at the same time, the processes that would make that country wealthy necessitated the extirpation of Black and Brown people. And so we cannot move forward with understanding the etiology of global change phenomena, including climate change, including the pollution of soils and waters, and so forth, without acknowledging the direct contradiction in maintaining ecology and global change science as is, without interrogating its links to the origins of the problem it means to investigate, right? There's a circularity with that. And so critical ecology is an ideological intervention into that circularity. Okay. And so we're going to share a little bit more about what that looks like in practice, right? So what does a liberatory etiology of global change look like? We like to use this kind of heuristic tool to orient what we mean by linking social systems to biophysical change. So here on the left side, you see we have the words tertiary, secondary, and primary driver. And the word driver is really commonly used as a description of any sort of forcing or process that takes place that creates the circumstances for a particular phenomenon to arise. So down at the bottom of this triangle, we see biophysical factors. And in our kind of critical ecology framing, we would describe biophysical factors, those direct physical processes, as primary drivers of global change. So these are things like, well, we'll get into that next. Secondary drivers, so things that are not directly physical processes, but are instead related to human activities, we would describe that as secondary drivers. And then at the top, we have tertiary drivers. So these are the ideas and these are the beliefs that undergird and support direct human activities. So these are the social systems and logics that motivate our choices as human society. And these are kind of the precursor to the direct human activities, right? So tertiary drivers influence secondary drivers, influence primary drivers. And so what do those look like? Well, here, primary drivers here at the bottom of the triangle would be things like temperature, right? So rising temperature, or pH, so acidification of soils and waters, changes in moisture availability, changes in biodiversity. These are sort of the primary processes that are changing under global change, which have all of these other outcomes and physical consequences, ecological consequences. But just a step above those primary drivers are these secondary drivers that cause the primary drivers. So we can usually see these described very vaguely in the ecological scientific literature as human activities, really generalized, typically things like fossil fuel burning or extraction, things like agribusiness or industrial ag, things like logging or what is generally described as land use change. And these really broad categories of human activities are just kind of given responsibility or given the role of causality without any deeper investigation of the systems that made those activities possible. And so critical ecology is interested in connecting all of this to the tertiary drivers, these ideas or beliefs or systems which started as kind of concepts, socially held concepts that made their way into law, right? So there's a direct connection between ideas and those ideas getting codified into rules. And those rules allowing certain people and certain activities to move about the world, right? And to create these secondary drivers. So some tertiary drivers include the concept of manifest destiny, the concept of white supremacy over other racial and ethnic groups, the concept of patriarchy or male supremacy, anti-Blackness, specifically the opposition and oppression of people who are identified and racialized as Black, ableism against people with disabilities, capitalism as a justification and a valid political economic system, and neoliberalism, again, as another valid political and economic system. And so again, critical ecology is saying we usually relegate these tertiary, secondary, and primary drivers to separate areas of study. And the problem with that is that we cannot deeply begin to address the origins of these primary drivers, which is the main concern or area of interest for basic ecology, if we can't make explicit and measurable connections to these tertiary drivers. And so that is the work that we're setting out to do. Okay, I'm going to take a breath. Alexis, can I take a breath? Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a sip of water before I start talking about the loci of application. Yeah, you too. You do that too. All right. Okay, so we've talked about why critical ecology is a needed response and intervention in global change science, but we haven't talked about how that actually looks in practice. Where do these ideas and frameworks get applied? And so critical ecology as a study is also something that needs to be kind of applied in different spheres in which we operate. And so I'm describing that as the loci of application for critical ecology, like the sites of application, which I really coarsely break down into the individual self, right? The individual researcher or student, the knowledge producing community, so the immediate body of people who are involved and invested in the process of studying and understanding global change, which includes researchers but is not exclusive to researchers, and then broader society, right? The world in which the research community operates in and is a part of, as well as the world, the broader world that has precipitated the problems we are facing due to global change. Okay. So let's start by looking at the self, right? So what is the role of the individual researcher in applying this critical ecology theory? First of all, we are all responsible for interrogating our positionality and power, right? Where do you stand, and where you stand as an individual researcher with regard to global systemic power is important to understanding the questions that you actually ask, right? And I'll give an example. So I am a member of the colonized global majority, right? I recognize that as part of my identity has actually been completely invaluable to the fact that I thought that there needs to be something like critical ecology, but that doesn't exist. And I felt it necessary. And that is really informed by who I am, my position. A member you might also be a member of the colonizing oppressor groups, right? So recognizing your positionality may help you to better understand where your blind spots may lie, where your biases may lie, right? So the other side of that is that even identifying as a member of a colonizing or oppressor group, and when I say colonizing oppressor groups, I don't mean that only group of people who have historically been involved in colonizing lands are oppressors, because we know that our social systems in the modern world really center around white supremacy, and that is linked to but not the same as colonial power, right? So you might be a member of an oppressor group, but you might also consider yourself part of the allied other, right? So can you identify yourself as both a member of an oppressor group, but also aligned with the struggles of those who are oppressed, right? Those are a couple of ways that you might start to reflexively think about your positionality and power, right? Treating personal reflection as a part of action, right? So another way that critical ecology says, as an individual, here is how we practice doing critical ecology, is by treating personal reflection, this investigation of the self and one's own power, as a part of your praxis, right? This is coming from Paulo Freire. The Pedagogy of the Oppressed is the text that this draws from. So it holds that critical reflection is also action. Freire says, treat your interiority as a refugium from the active dehumanization that is enacted. Oh, I think that came from When You Go Quiet. So that's from Sequoia. It says, treat your inferiority as a refugium from the active dehumanization that is enacted within communities of research and professionalism, right? So this is to say that in order to be critical ecologists, we must also be reflexive and interior about our positionality and power within our research. Ooh. Nope. Okay. The next locus of application for critical ecology is the immediate community within which we work. So the community in which we produce knowledge. And for us, that could be the Critical Ecology Lab, our group, but it also refers to the broader scientific research community. So first of all, we must, as a community, acknowledge that dominant values and norms have origins in class and race position, right? And the ways that our broader communities of research interact are influenced by histories of classism and racism. And without that acknowledgement, we will continue to perpetuate those norms in our universities, in our research groups, in our professional societies, and more. Those norms influence the communal production of theory and methods, right? So the prevailing social and economic context influences the theory that is produced and the methods we produce. And so critical ecology holds that by engaging non-Western epistemologies, we can start to undo those harmful social and economic contexts that produced the sort of majority of ecological and global change theory, right? We can start to uproot the oppression and marginalization that was ongoing throughout the periods of time when those theories and methods were developed. Critical ecology holds that all inquiry is political and moral. And again, this is coming from critical indigenous pedagogy. And this is, and that we are centering, excuse me, a borderlands epistemology, right? The idea that those from the margins have hold knowledge that would not come to the center without struggle, right? And so ecological theories that are should be informed by the experiences of colonized people and the allied others. And this again draws from critical indigenous pedagogy. Okay. And finally, critical ecology can transform the individual self and holds that it is our responsibility as researchers to interrogate our positions and transform the oppressor within. It holds that the knowledge-producing community must also be critiqued and transformed through these these non-Western epistemologies, centering Black feminism as a starting point for that critique and transformation. And then we can go on to use those sort of inner transformations to describe and transform broader systems. So centering interactions between people of European descent and people of non-European descent is a useful sort of site of identification for points of origin of major global change phenomena. Right? I'm going to say that one more time. We're not only centering the interactions between people of European descent and people of non-European descent for the sake of identifying where harm was done, but actually as a useful heuristic for developing new questions about global change. So can we use historical interactions between these populations, which have typically resulted in the oppression of non-European people, as guideposts for searching out and identifying global change phenomena to more deeply investigate within a social context? So patterns in resource extraction, distribution, and occlusion can also be guideposts for investigating how global change has and will continue to unfold, right? So looking towards historical and contemporary sites of resource extraction, distribution, and occlusion, right, keeping from some and for others, are another way of kind of looking for social guideposts to asking global change questions. And then finally, within broader society, we need to hold, as we investigate these patterns of social and ecological interplay, we need to hold these patterns up to the light of critique of the neoliberal political economy, right? So we're interested in identifying where global change phenomena are linked to these moments of extraction and oppression, but we also need to then use sort of critique of neoliberalism as a way of really understanding the why, right? We might establish the links, but we need to understand why. And that is where critique of neoliberal political economy becomes useful for transforming broader society. Woof. All right. That was plenty. Take it away, Ilexis. You are muted. Let me see if I can unmute you.
I'm sorry. Here I am. Okay. One of the major concepts that we're discussing here is that the origin stories or roots of Western ecological investigation is rooted in the exact same thing that is fueling industries with extractive processes that are destroying said environments. So the study of the environment in Western institutions is coming from the exact same place. One of the ways that we can exemplify that and how they're working under the same logics is with NEON. It's a federally funded but privately operated commercial research and development organization. And its sole purpose is to collect large amounts of data. It operates with the logic that more is better and emphasizes applications of this data to make predictions about global change, but it never specifies to what ends and for whom. And scientists are always collecting more data, but at what point does this information get applied to policy, natural disaster preparedness, improvements in infrastructure, and climate change mitigation strategies? There is something noble about expanding knowledge and taking these measurements for information with no accountability or driving reason other than endless expansion. And technological advances lead to more data, and more data leads to more technology. So there's a continuum from big data science to the tech industry. And there's no clear management structure or intention behind it. Any of these proposed or suggested applications for understanding ecologies on such a massive scale for climate change or whatnot is never followed through with any materialized outcome. And this mentality kind of extends to their DEI initiatives, where they sort of frame diversity of perspectives in science as an additional thing that we can collect and track and tack onto massive data collecting as a machine. So the outreach and community engagement statements are deliberately empty and directionless, and they make promises to be inclusive of marginalized people without ever specifying or addressing histories, or how this data comes back to the community where it was taken from. An analogous situation that I've come into contact with in the Bay Area, sorry, is the rise of biotech startups. Many of these companies are thought to be forward-thinking and progressive and have exceptional benefits for their employees and often have diversity or social impact statements. Yet these industries are responsible for the displacement of hundreds of Bay Area residents. And it facilitates the gentrification, resegregation of low-income and of color communities in the Bay. And there's this ambivalence towards the rippling social impact that these tech industries have in the social, in the Bay Area. And we're allowed to do research that just kind of operates under the assumption that if we have more information and let science run its course, that the outcome will inevitably be good. And it kind of utilizes the danger of objectivity and neutral, the neutral hand of science being good. But the questions that it's led us to ask so far have done more to fuel industries of exploitation of the environment than it has gone to deconstructing these systems of extractive processes.
Yeah. If I can just put a fine point on what you've already said really well. The idea that that understanding what is happening to a granular level in a spatially all-encompassing way through the sort of extreme vision of NEON data collection is an example of the kind of rudderlessness of global change science, right? It lacks the steering that is necessary or that comes from having a clearly articulated etiology of global change, right? If we had a shared and rigorously understood understanding of the social origins of the phenomena that we are interested in monitoring, there might be a more decisive, more well-articulated and more directly supportive approach that is supportive of the marginalized and most vulnerable communities who are affected by global change, right? So this massive amount of wealth and resource that is driven into these efforts towards more is better, right? More monitoring, more data is better. They are resources that could be more finely and more clearly directed towards a liberatory goal, right? If we understood the ways that oppression have shaped global change, we would then direct our efforts towards more clearly targeting what needs to be monitored from the perspective of ending and stymieing global change. We can't do that because global change, ecology, and biology lack a cohesive etiology, and that is why critical ecology might be an intervention into that might better channel these massive amounts of resource and labor that go into big science. So I hope that wasn't too redundant, Alexis. You did a great job, but I like to put extra fine points on literally everything.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna go mute myself.
So these were questions that we came up with for fueling discussion in the breakout rooms for our presentation that we gave. So I guess we can just go off of these questions and acknowledge that addressing our individual pain as a result of colonization and science is a part of doing the work of critical ecology. So many BIPOC researchers, Black, Indigenous, and people of color researchers harbor strained relationships with scientific exploration of the environment due to colonial legacies against our communities and land. And we asked, how does this shape who is invested and what is asked? And acknowledging and healing. Sorry, should we go into each question?
No, I don't think so, but I just wanted to like locate this question on those three kind of nested circles of the loci of critical ecology. And these questions are about the individual self, right? So it's about identifying your positionality and power, but it's also in that individual reflexivity, it's also about acknowledging the ways that historical and contemporary acts of violence that happen through these kind of oppressive systems, such as colonization, such as white supremacist governments under which we live, have shaped our relationship to scientific exploration. So I just wanted to kind of place that this is the reflexive individual work. This is one question that one might ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our unique identities and our questions about ecology and our environment must be grounded in this inward reflection and our values. And we must first make ourselves a site for decolonization before we can move into our communities and into broader society.
Big snaps for that line. I just want to emphasize it. We must make ourselves sites for decolonization. That is why there are concentric circles, because in the interest of changing a society that through these sort of oppressive systems has brought about processes of global change, and we are interested in sort of scientifically studying those processes, we must start with ourselves and identifying and decolonizing ourselves as we move out into the world of research and beyond. Thank you, Alexis. Sorry to interrupt.
No interruption. Thank you so much, Sue, for educating me and educating Critical Ecology Lab and for starting this field. It's been an amazing space to make connections with my interpersonal work and the work that I do as a scientist. And yeah, I really, really have a lot of appreciation and gratitude towards you and the work that you do.
I feel just so grateful and honored that I get to spend time working on these questions with you, Ilexis. And I really mean it when I say I love you, and I'm so grateful that we could sit here and work on what critical ecology is together. So thank you, my friend. Thank you all who tuned in for this workshop, and we will leave it here. We're going to just quickly offer thanks. First of all, thank you to my amazing collaborator, co-presenter, Ilexis. If I start crying, it's because I have no tact. Okay. I want to thank Bree K. Jones and Rory Burton, who were our American Sign Language interpreters for our first recording or our first presentation of this workshop from the SoCal Pro Bono ASL organization. I want to thank Kunal Palawat, who just got their master's in soil science from University of Arizona. Kunal has been really just a steer and a rudder and a pace setter for me. And I'm so honored to get to work with Kunal in developing questions in theory of critical ecology. My great thanks to Professor Todd Dawson and the Dawson Lab at UC Berkeley, where I was a postdoc. Todd Dawson has been an amazing supporter, resources, encouragement, intellect, all of it. So thank you, Todd. Thank you to Inquiring Systems, Inc., which is our full sponsor, and Pam Campbell, its CEO, who has been a champion of our lab and the work that I've set forth to do. Thanking Olivia Horwedel, who is a beautiful person, an artist, a scientist, marine scientist, and she is our artist in residence and designed some of the graphics that you see in this presentation. Thank you to my employer, the California Academy of Sciences, for the support of me through the Osher Fellowship at the Cal Academy, and thank you to the Osher Foundation. And not least in any way, thank you to the Chochenyo Ohlone people. I get to live and work here on your land, and I'm grateful for the place, the space, the communing with nature that I get to do that sets my heart in the right place to do this work. So thank you to our original land stewards. Okay, before I cry, thank you, Ilexis, again, and I think we're signing off. All right, so you can contact us here. I'd find more details at our website. And if you liked this presentation, if you thought this work was important, we do this free of charge. We are not paid for any of this work. And you can support us by donating through our website or at Venmo at critical_ecology.
Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you. See you later, Ilexis.
Bye.